The next session would be about archives, and I would say collaboration between archives and how, specifically in the Jewish world and in the Israeli context, collaboration between archives and how the changing world is affecting archives. Digitization, things that you've been discussing over time, and we started Europeana yesterday, and things like that. How are they affecting the world of archives today, or how are they affecting the world of archives as we have seen it before into the future? The session would go, we will have two presentations, one from Nobel, and the other one by Chezkie Kasnett. So Robin will be the first presenter. She manages the archives and the libraries program at Rothschild Foundation, Hanadiv, Europe. In her capacity, she is currently responsible for Yerusha, an initiative to aggregate and support surveys of Jewish archives in Europe. Correct? Good.
Thank you, Yani. So good afternoon. Before I begin, just two disclaimers. The first is that, yes? So again, before I begin, two disclaimers. The first is that I, like Ido this morning, I'm not an archivist and I'm not a librarian, so forgive me if I lack some of the specific vocabulary sometimes. And the second is that you all have made me quite paranoid about copyright. So let me say that the photos that I have in my presentation are taken from, they're photographs that I took of archives that I visited across Europe, most of which we funded. So I hope you'll forgive the lack of captions. So I wanted to begin, actually, with the words from Professor John Clear, who, until his passing a few years ago, was one of the world's leading authorities on Jewish archives in Europe. He writes that when I was first granted access into each of the archives, in Russia, in Ukraine, in Belarus, and in Lithuania, I spent the first part of every visit, whether an hour or a day, frantically copying down the number and description of individual archives, acting as if this was the last chance to mark their existence for posterity, and those frantic days are gone. Our Yerusha, literally our inheritance, is to be found in the vast stores of books, pamphlets, manuscripts, and ephemera that are held in archives and libraries across Europe. Their pages, leaves, folios, and folders contain the story of the Jews who lived in Europe and those that continue to live on that continent. They display, I'm sure you'll agree, the heights of cultural success and economic success as well as the depths of abject poverty and persecution. Our Yerusha project, which I'm delighted to present to you today, will seek to map Jewish documentary heritage in Europe, building on regional surveys and existing catalogs, as well as giving smaller, lesser-known repositories a chance to mark out their existence, so that the researcher need not fear that the document absent from, or that's left unrecorded, will disappear from history. Yerusha intends to give these archives a place in the broader historical context, which, like Jewish history in general, cuts across national boundaries. So although the frantic days that John Clear described in 1999 may be in the past, the need to provide a simple, accessible framework for discovering our rich and diverse heritage is real and very much in the present. So first, a bit about the foundation. I represent the Rothschild Foundation, Hanadiv, Europe, and we are a grant-giving body that's based in the UK, but which has a remit to cover Jewish heritage institutions across Europe. Yerusha is the latest of our project, and this conference gives me both the excellent opportunity, to present our progress so far, as well as I hope to gain some feedback from yourselves. We're in quite early days, and I think that any suggestions, comments, or criticisms would be quite welcome. So, on to the framework of my presentation, which will be organized around these 5 quite simple questions. The first is, what is Yerusha, and what does it aim to do? Quite basic. Second, why is this project necessary, and particularly, why is it necessary now? The third is, why the Rothschild Foundation, Hanadiv, Europe? Why are we well placed to take the lead on this project? What makes us suited to this work? And fourth, what has been done before, and So that's kind of what related projects are underway now, and also how does the Yerusha project relate to them. And fifth, what have we accomplished so far in the context of our project? Now, I understand, and forgive me, that these are very basic questions to answer. They're necessary, but they're basic. And so I do hope that during the question and answer session, we'll reserve some time for maybe the more philosophical or the more ethical, the more ideological aspects that a project such as Yerusha may raise. So to begin at the beginning, what is Yerusha and what does it aim to do? Yerusha will be an online portal providing a central point of access for collection-level surveys of Jewish documentary heritage held in Europe. And I also want to add to that that in the first few years of our project, we're going to make grants available for further survey work to encourage new survey projects. But even without that extra addition, you can see that that's quite a mouthful. So I hope that it would be helpful if I go through that a bit more in detail and break it down. So first, Yerusha will be, first and foremost, an online portal. And therefore, of course, available to the general public, to scholars, and to researchers of all sorts in Europe and around the world. As much as is possible, we aim to take advantage of the online nature of our project. Particularly, we hope to collect information from researchers who might have visited an archive and have some words of advice pertaining to practicalities, such as when an archive is open, when it will be shut for renovations, and even, unfortunately, in some countries still, where bribes might be in order. We like to think of it as a TripAdvisor or a Yelp-type service, but for archives, in that sense. The Yerusha team believes that researchers actually that frequently researchers work more closely with individual collections than an archivist who may be responsible for hundreds of such collections. So the researcher will gain information about, or specialist information, about the intricacies and the eccentricities about individual collections. And we hope to capture that data and to share it as widely as possible. Moreover, we believe that having an online presence means that we'll gather a nucleus of a network of people interested in archives across Europe, whether they be researchers or if they are archivists. We hope to launch such a network more formally, a collegial association, at the European Association of Jewish Studies Quadrennial Congress in 2014. I know it's quite dangerous to mention dates in such a public way, but there you go, live on the edge. Now the next thing is that Yerusha will run to collection level. Again, all my photos. Although we recognize, of course, the immense value in being able to view an individual document online or catalog to item level, the practicalities of orchestrating such a massive digitization of material from such a vast number of sources and institutions would basically make this project too unwieldy to be accomplished. It would require such huge timescales, such huge budgets, and such a great manpower that it would just never end. Essentially, we wanted the foundation's part of the project to have a clear endpoint, and we are content to acknowledge that Yerusha is not the final word in this field, but instead a springboard or a stepping stone to further work. We like to think of ourselves as providing the road signs rather than your complex GPS system. Both might be helpful in getting you where you need to go, but they're not mutually exclusive, and in fact, probably work best in tandem. Moving swiftly on. What are we surveying? So we're surveying Jewish documentary heritage, and that term, as we said before, is not at all as clear-cut as it seems. We're going to take, within our definition, we're going to take the lead of one of our key collaborators, who are the Jewish Archival Survey Project, which is a project run out of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, to survey documents of Jewish relevance in the former Soviet Union. And so they've categorized Jewish documentary heritage as these 5 things: the communal, or the Pinkasim, minute books, the official output of the Jewish community. Second, the semi-communal, so things that might derive from societies related to the Jewish community, but not the official Jewish community, maybe Hever Kadishas or that sort of thing. Third, the extra-communal, records that concern the Jewish community but are not produced by them, and the supercommunal, which are state decrees. This is probably just teaching your grandmother how to suck eggs, as we say in England, very basic stuff for all of you. And of course, private records, which again run the gamut from rabbinical to commercial to familial. Our remit is admittedly broad. These categories encompass a huge range of material. We aim to winnow down not by the categories, but instead by the institutions. So we're going to be progressing project by project, institution by institution, and we figure that it will be actually quite some time before we need to winnow down in terms of categories by progressing in that gradual manner. And yes. So finally, geographic remit of Yerusha. As an initiative of the Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe, whose funding is limited to Europe, it stands to reason that we will focus on Europe. Like our foundation, I must say, we do take quite a broad view of Europe, however. Unfortunately, not so broad as to include Israel, I'm sorry. But we do include non-member states such as Russia, Ukraine, and Moldova. And I think that's quite a good thing since those places have such a lot to say about Jewish history, not only in Europe, but for the world. Now, despite this broad view of Europe, myself and my project team are keenly aware of the limitations imposed by our geographic remit. Of course, large volumes of relevant material are held elsewhere outside of Europe, whether it be in the United States, in Canada, in Israel, in South America, and any number of other places, Australia. But our decision to confine the project in the first instances to Europe is not to deny their existence. It's not to deny their importance, and it's certainly not to deny that these documents stored elsewhere have much to teach us about European Jewry. However, as it is, we've set ourselves an enormous task, which will take years to complete. Were we to include more geographically spread material, I'd fear that we'd never finish at all. Also on the topic of our geographic remit, I think it's here worth mentioning that since we're not confined to clear-cut national borders, but instead to a shared religious, ethnic, and communal heritage, that because of that, we'll be dealing with archives from multiple places, with multiple archival histories, with multiple standards and multiple approaches. So that's one of the major challenges that we face. It also means that we have very little authority to impose our own standard on our participants. And for that reason, we've made the barriers of entry to our project very low and kept it rather technically unsophisticated. So we'll just be requiring a simplified EAD from our participants on the understanding that needs to come from them. We wanted to make sure that they are able to participate. While it will be simplified, I have to say that we are also looking to make it remain a useful resource. So that, I think, sums up that. Hopefully this makes a little bit more sense now. Yerusha will be an online portal providing a central point of access to collection-level surveys of Jewish documentary heritage held in Europe. So moving on to the next on our list is, why is Yerusha necessary? To answer this question, I'd like to take you back to a brainstorming session that we held, that the Foundation convened, I should say, in October 2010. We brought together 9 experts in European Jewish archives and asked each of them what the field needed most. And as you can imagine, many suggestions came to the fore, many desiderata were articulated, but we've found that the common theme running through all of those desiderata was visibility. Now, why visibility? First, our experts noted that although the collapse of the Soviet bloc, or the Soviet Union, made an array of archival records technically available, scholars of Jewish history were still actually limited by what had been made visible through finding aids and through surveys. So in other words, what could be found? I think this was mentioned maybe a bit earlier. In a sense, invisibility was tantamount to non-existence, in a way. Second, visibility would reveal any holes in the archival record, any places where we know that there's been extensive Jewish involvement, Jewish presence for years, but for which we don't have documents. So we're hoping that this second aspect might feed our grant program and might direct us a little bit more. Third, visibility means accountability. Our experts reasoned that if Jewish collections were known to exist, they could not be moved and they could not be stolen and they could not be destroyed without facing opposition from either our own network and our own community or from the general scholarly community. Finally, our group was concerned that such increased visibility not be the sole preserve of wealthy national institutions with budgets to maintain digitization programs, online presences, online catalogs, and their own websites, but instead be available also to smaller archives and organizations. A complete European survey of Jewish sources could potentially have a democratizing effect, allowing a scholar to locate the papers of a single Jew as easily as the state decrees that shaped his or her life. To again use the words of Professor Klier, we want to enable the study of European Jewry not only from the top down, but also from the bottom up. For all these reasons, visibility, or literally putting Jewish archival records on the map, was paramount. And I hope that Yerusha, with its broad inclusivist approach and its web presence, can be seen as a direct response to the concerns raised during the brainstorming session 18 months ago. Thirdly, my third question I'm hoping to answer is why the Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe and why we're well positioned to take on this project. Well, we have a long-standing interest, or, well, it doesn't seem so long when you view it as in the millennium, but we have had an interest since 2005 at least, since the mid-2000s, in the preservation and promotion of Jewish documentary heritage in Europe. This began with the support of smaller scale projects, such as the transfer of material to acid-free boxes, or such as projects like this one, which was to remove problematic shelving and to instead replace it with more stable shelving. And don't worry, we didn't destroy the books. The photo was simply taken before they had a chance to be replaced. Now, 2 years ago, we've actually focused more directly on Jewish heritage, and with that came an involvement in larger scale projects, and this is the project of Judah Schlanger, which is entitled Books Within Books, a project to digitize and also unite medieval Hebrew fragments that are held in the bindings of notary books or of any sorts of books really across Europe. So that's a portal as well. Another project is the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, which Haim, I think, will be talking about in more detail later on. And we are primarily involved with that through the funding of some of its partners, such as the Neod Archives, which we funded a digitization of their Jewish council during the Holocaust. So, a final mention. It's actually a bit of a who's who in the audience, isn't it? The final mention is the Center for Jewish History. And we funded some European participation. So we funded the travel costs for some of the European participants to their conference last November. I do apologize for this picture. I was at a loss for how to represent experts in European Jewish archives, but there you go. So in addition to maybe it's a good job, I don't know. In addition to, but I'm a woman, so maybe it balances out. In addition to the knowledge we've gained through our own funding programs, having been active in this field for a number of years, the Foundation has built its own formal and informal network of advisors on Jewish archives in Europe. We've made contact with both important leaders and directors of national institutions, as well as the individual archivists working at the coalface, with trained archivists, as well as with top-level researchers, all of whom bring valuable insights to the state, the content, and the needs of Jewish archives in Europe. So we'd like to think that that helps us as well. A final reason that I should mention is that we as a foundation have a final reason that we are qualified to do this work, is that we as a foundation have an enthusiasm for archives and for the preservation of Jewish documentary sources. And perhaps even more than these factual reasons I mentioned earlier, this enthusiasm sets us apart from other funding bodies. We have the will and the drive to make a project such as this succeed and to make Yerusha, and to follow through Yerusha to its end goal. Fourthly, the fourth thing I'm going to mention here is what has been done before. 4 minutes, that's fine. So there's been, I'll just zip through these actually, because I don't think I need to labor too much on them. The first is a directory of Jewish heritage institutions. Now this is more or less a phone book. It's just a Word document. It just lists phone numbers and email addresses for the different institutions holding Jewish heritage in Europe. Second has been a series of conferences, Potsdam, Prague, and Vilnius. Each of them, I think, raised a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of momentum for their concerns for Jewish heritage in Europe. But each of them actually concluded with a call for a pan-European survey. None of them actually saw that through. So we're hoping to pick that up a bit. Third is the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People. I'll let Hadassah obviously talk more about their remarkable, important efforts. Unfortunately, though, it remains the case that to make best use of their resources, at the Central Archives, the researcher actually needs to travel here and to be in Jerusalem to use their inventories, catalogs, and microfilm in person. Fourth, there have been a series of national and regional surveys. One of them was the JTS survey I mentioned just moments ago. Another one was in Italy on their national survey called the CIUSA Network. Another one was the survey of Anglo-Jewish archives conducted by the University of Southampton. And finally, I know that the Leo Baeck Institute has conducted a survey of German Jewish archives in the 1990s. Now, one thing I'll say about all of these surveys is, first of all, no one's ever linked them all up. And second of all, it's very uneven what's available online and what's not. Of the projects I've just listed, only half are available online. And fifth is Judaica Europeana, which I won't talk about too much because we've had a whole day on it. Sixth is the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure. Again, I won't mention too much on that since Haim will touch on it in much more detail than me. Finally, what have we accomplished so far in the context of our project? So first we had a workshop called Toward a Pan-European Survey, and that's all of us at the workshop looking very happy, slightly cold, but very happy. The second thing is we've assembled a subcommittee that's composed of three European archivists responsible for Jewish collections, or specifically, well, Jewish collections that have a lot to say about Jewish history, let's say, and one scholar from America who's quite knowledgeable in European Jewish archives, and also one technical expert who, in the digital humanities, who we're hoping can help us with the digital infrastructure we'll be needing. The first Yerusha grant round has been run to completion. In other words, we've awarded 6 grants. And we've given out this year £135,000 towards new survey projects. The penultimate thing, or really the ultimate thing in my view, is we have our staffing in place. We have an intern. We also have just appointed a project manager, who is Gabor Kader of the Hungarian Jewish Archives. And he comes to us with over 15 years of experience working in archives in Europe, and Central and Eastern Europe, as well as with developing online educational resources, and we think he's going to be a great addition, and hopefully, well, I know he's going to start actually in the 3rd week of June, so quite excited about that. And we have an initial website, and that's just the screenshot of our website, and I've given you the address so you can go there yourselves and have a look around. Now, just to conclude, clearly we have only begun what will be a long-term and a serious undertaking. However, I hope that this brief presentation has given you a taste of what Yerusha is and where we intend to go with it. We'll provide a simple, informative portal for researchers, illuminating the huge array of Jewish documentary heritage within Europe, and in so doing, ensuring its continued relevance and use for decades to come. These records comprise our shared heritage, and we intend that anyone with an internet connection, a computer, and an interest will be able at least to learn where this important academic and cultural resource resides, whether that be in a national archive or a synagogue library. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take questions at the end, okay, after our panelists comment on the presentations. The next presentation will be by Chezkie Kasnett. He's okay. Chezkie is working for the National Library. He is the digital projects manager here at the National Library of Israel. In his capacity, he is responsible for a project called Re'i. Re'i is a project funded by the Israeli government as part of the Tamar project, which looks to see how to preserve heritage information. And Re'i in specific is looking how to combine and aggregate information from different archives within Israel.
Thank you, Yaniv, for that wonderful introduction. Okay. So actually, Yaniv just kind of gave half my presentation. So yeah, that's quite all right.
We're saving some time.
Exactly. So kind of to touch on what Yaniv already mentioned, the Israel Archive Network project is a sub-project within the Tamar project, with Tamar being a very large-scale, wide-scope project whose objective is to rehabilitate both tangible and non-tangible cultural heritage assets throughout the country. Now, the Israel Archive Network project is obviously focusing on archives that have cultural heritage material. And our problem, I guess our main challenge with these archives kind of boils down to two main points. The first being that most historical archives in Israel are relatively unknown and inaccessible by the general public. Secondly, there's a very real and present danger of losing very historically valuable material that's contained in these archives. Without going too much into detail as to why this is so, but I'm sure most of you can imagine this of course has to do with, well, lack of funding and ignorance and basically just disregard for the material over a course of many years. Now, why are we doing this now? I think now is a very opportune time to be attacking this kind of project, and not only this kind of project, but other projects as well, including Yerusha and other similar projects. For one, we live in a very different world right now. Gone are the days where if I want to do some research or look some stuff up, I go ahead, put on my jacket, head down to the local archive or library, and spend some time there. Today, I kind of sit in front of my computer in my pajamas and expect everything to be at my fingertips. I expect everything to be at my fingertips. So, bottom line, today's archive is a vastly different environment than what it has been until now. And of course, not only archives, libraries as well, but the focus of this talk is, of course, on archives. The digital age has brought us new opportunities, tremendous new opportunities to deal with this, and of course, a whole set of challenges and problems, and that's obviously a separate, not even a discussion, I think, a whole separate conference. So bottom line, the archive still has the same role, but what has changed is the method. So the project partners on the Israel Network project is firstly the Prime Minister's Office of the State of Israel. The project is being mostly funded and directed by the Prime Minister's Office. The National Library of Israel was tasked with the project management of the project, of really seeing the project through. And we're working closely as a kind of a partnership with the Israel State Archives, who are mostly kind of responsible for the whole content and standards aspect, if you will, of the project. We're working with a number of other organizations and institutions across the country, but primarily the Israel Archives and Information Association, who represent the archives and are a strategic partner also as far as standards and, well, archive-related stuff, because I'm not an archivist as well. So bottom line, what is the Israel Archive Network? Well, first of all, it's a platform for archives to improve the quality of and access to their collections. And secondly, it's an access point, a single access point to the digitized and non-digitized holdings of these archives. And contrary to a lot of other projects, we're going to be doing this on an item, on an object level. So the project has two core objectives. The first one being, as I mentioned, access to all this valuable material that's kind of spread out across all these archives around the country. And secondly, the long-term digital preservation of all this material. Taking a look at the access, well, first of all, so it's a single access point for the material. The idea is to incorporate many, many archives into this single portal so that the user, the researcher, via a single access point, we'll be able to access all this material. And of course, in so doing, we're going to implement various sets of tools for archives to join this initiative on their own. From the long-term digital preservation perspective, the project is looking to digitize and catalog 50 archives over the course of 6 years. The project is going to incorporate a long-time digital preservation strategy. And in so doing, we're going to adopt the Open Archive Information System framework for long-term preservation. The idea of the long-term preservation is also for the library to hold a national preservation copy, if you will, of these digital objects and their records. And of course, to enable additional archives to participate in this platform where we would provide for them a long-term digital preservation solution. So the expected results of the project are, number one, to raise awareness of cultural heritage material across the country and even abroad, to create a cohesive resource of Israeli cultural heritage sources, to engage new audiences across the country who until now, again, are unaware or have had no access to these resources, to create a new tool for research and education, a single access point to reach this material, and of course, the long-term digital preservation of all this material. Speaking, of course, of digitization, I was led to understand that Steve Jobs is still quite busy and is engaging new audiences as well, wherever he may be. So the project itself is going to be split into 3 phases. The first phase is going to be an initial pilot phase that's going to be devoted to setting up the infrastructure of the project and basically processing an initial 9 archives. Those 9 archives basically represent a cross-section of the different kind of archives that we're going to be dealing with in the context of the project. So we're going to start off by implementing a survey of the archives across the country, and that has actually started this week with Yad Vashem taking a lead on that under Haim Gertner. We're going to be implementing an archive management system, the platform that I mentioned earlier. And this is actually quite revolutionary because, like similar projects who have also implemented some sort of platform for metadata preservation, we're taking this a step further. And what we're going to be doing in the context of the project is offering an actual archive management system for archives that don't have one today. And surprisingly or not surprisingly, there are a lot of archives who just don't have it, and meaning that a lot of their holdings have never been cataloged. So they're sitting on these virtual treasures, and no one really has any clue what's there. The stuff's never been cataloged, never been recorded. They don't have the funding to do so. They don't have the manpower and resources to do so. They don't have the hardware and software to do so. So we're going to be giving them a platform, which will be a hosted platform, so it's in the cloud. All they need basically is an internet connection and a workstation. and they'll be able to go ahead and catalog their collections. We'll be implementing a long-term digital preservation solution, which will hold the digital surrogates and their records of the information. Obviously, of course, putting up a web portal, this access point, and digitizing these first 9 pilot archives, 2 of which, as we speak, are already near completion. The second phase of the project, which is really kind of the core part of the project, is digitizing an additional 41 archives, and then adding many, many, many more archives, providing them the tools to do so, and doing obviously a lot of aggressive marketing to the archives in the country, and really giving them the incentive to participate in the program. And then, of course, phase 3 of the project is the sustainability of the project, basically maintaining the information going forward. So in terms of the model for the project, what we're talking about here is aggregating item-level solutions. And that's also quite an aggressive objective. And in thinking of how we're going to go about doing that, we're thinking of a number of different models. And we're leaning towards implementing a hybrid model as a solution to the project, with the metadata being held in a centralized database, because again, we're going to be importing all this metadata into the project, so maintaining all that in a centralized database. However, the whole search and access aspect of the project, utilizing a distributed model for that. So a user who's in the portal and accessing, searching for material is not going to be searching it on the database of the project, but rather a federated search will basically will be taking place across the websites of all these different archives. And then, of course, the final point, distributed empowerment. What I mean by this is, well, we're allowing, of course, archivists basically a tremendous tool to go ahead and improve and develop their archives. And the idea here is also to empower the public to do the same. And what we'd like to do is encourage the public through crowdsourcing to participate in improving these archives via tagging content, possibly OCR correction, and other similar ideas. I believe that in order for a project like this to succeed, the value of the project has to exceed the sum of the parts. And let's take a look at a theoretical example here. If a user of ours on the portal decides to do a search for Joseph Trumpeldor, for those of you unfamiliar with the name, Joseph Trumpeldor was an active Zionist, the early part of the 20th century. He is famously known for having coined the phrase, Tov lamut ba'ad artzenu, it is good to die for our country. And he apparently said this right before he died in action defending Kibbutz Tel Chai in 1920. So a user who does a search for this person will find a search result in a specific archive. This is his ID card. So if I, say, do a search in a particular website of a particular archive, I will find one or two results. I'll go to another archive and I'll find something similar. Here I found his university degree. However, the power of the access point, the power of a portal, is that if I do the same search, 2 words, Joseph Trumpeldor, I get all of the different objects that are held in all the archives around the country, and possibly even archives abroad if they choose to participate in the project. Wow, okay. I left all the jokes for the end, I guess I'll have to. So not only will I get all of the different documents that are held across all sorts of resources, but I can also put in here additional related content, such as YouTube videos, information about the Zionist Mule Corps, which he helped found. Okay, so just to go over some of the core challenges we have in this project. Taking a look at the archives. From the archive perspective, we have a lot of different standards, or none at all, to tell you the truth, across the archives in the country. We have different levels of cataloging, of hierarchy, different size organizations and structures of these organizations, and of course the very poor physical state of both the archives and the environments that they're held in. Taking a look at the technology, zoom in on that. Oh, okay, 1 second. Taking a look at the technology, so we have to combine here the metadata from all these different archives into a unified level of data, which is not going to be a simple challenge. We're going to have to, from this, create a cohesive, intuitive user experience, which is going to have to be suitable for a wide range of different users, from the academic researcher to the high school, 14-year-old high school kid who's doing a school project. So creating a user interface for that is going to be quite a challenge. And then, of course, we have the technology generation shift. Well, basically, by the time you can say the word digitization, it's already, we're moving on to the next technology. Okay, went backwards. Okay. Process. Okay. Gotta hold on to this thing. In terms of the process of the project, there's a lack of standards and unified methodology across the archives in the country. There are many agents involved in this project, so there's a lot of little toes and rather big toes to step on here. And then, of course, numerous languages that the content itself is in. I keep doing that. Okay. Okay, I couldn't have summed it up better than Paul Conway in terms of the technology challenge, where basically he says that the demand for this stuff is at its peak now, and as fast as we can kind of get this stuff out, the technology is already passé, and it just it's moving on. We kind of feel like we have to do this all over again, and I think Catherine, you touched on that this morning briefly. Okay, so how are we going to do this project? Well, for one, standards. We're going to stick to the OAIS, the Open Archive Information System framework. We're going to implement a number of archival standards such as ISAG, ISDEA, and a number of others. Obviously on a low level, in other words, so it can also have a low barrier of entry for different archives to participate. On the other hand, we do kind of have to maintain standards so that it doesn't get out of control and so that the information can be utilized going forward. We're going to stick to a keep it simple, stupid kind of attitude on the project. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. We'd like to reuse tools and methodologies that have already been implemented and used in similar projects. For example, Europeana, APNet, now Apex, the HOPE project in Italy as well. We want to involve the archives as much as possible, get their input, get their help in doing the work, and of course involving the public. Crowdsourcing, getting the public involved, having them help us enrich this material going forward. So what's in it for me, right? The archive out there in Israel. What's the incentive for them to participate in this project? We can pretty much break it down into two types of archives. One is the 50 or so archives that we're actually going to be funding the digitization and cataloging of. The second type of archive are the archives who we will not be funding, and that includes archives of corporations that hold culturally valuable material, the Electric Company and a number of other companies in Israel that have very interesting, very valuable collections. So for one, we're going to be offering a cloud-based archive management platform for those archives that don't have it. We're going to be offering a digitization service for those that need it, and for those that already have it or will be doing it on their own, we'll be offering our expertise in the matter. We'll be offering guidance, standards, different methodologies, for what formats to use, because obviously this whole area is very much, there's a lot of routes that one can follow in digitization. Basically, we're offering an archive the ability to upgrade themselves with a very low level of participation. Of course, we're offering the opportunity for archives to make themselves accessible to the public, to put themselves on the map, and in so doing, contrary to a lot of the thought of archivists, but at the end of the day, this actually increases traffic and increases visitors and public awareness of these archives. Thank you very much.
Our next presenter is Jean-Claude. Jean-Claude is the director of Alliance Israélite Universelle. My French is not very...
I'll say it again.
Yeah, please. You'll do it much better than I do. But the important thing, he is involved in many of the initiatives in Europe and in France and in Europe and worldwide to bring together Jewish archives.
Thank you very much, and even thanks. Take the opportunity to thank all the organization and everybody to be here with you. It's such a pleasure to meet you all again. So I am Jean-Claude Kuperminc in French, or Kuperminc in the British-speaking world, or Kuperminc originally. I'm from the Library and Archives of the Alliance Israélite Universelle in Paris. I will not tell you about the Alliance today because I'm only a discussant and not a presenter now. As you said, I have quite an experience now in all the cooperation business because we've been involved with the Alliance Archives and Library in many, many projects. And as far as archives indexes are concerned, I'm also a leader of a group in France called the French Commission for Jewish Archives, which published a few books many years ago, I'm afraid, about mapping archives of French Jewish interest. So, as many of you have attended this kind of convention in the last 15 years or so, and I think that what we hear now is that what the technology can give us is really, really incredible in matters of openness, in matter of data, in matter of accessibilities, and also that it's changed our mentalities. And I think that these two projects are really can really show that. In the papers you gave, and the session is focused on archives, of course, it is true that archives are historically maybe somewhat backwards when compared to libraries and museums when we talk about standardization of the data, for example. But I think that the gap is being filled now. But I still ask the question, should today's project focus on one media only? And because I know, for example, many book collections anywhere that could need exactly the same kind of treatment. I don't represent Judaica Europeana, but I'm part of it, and you've heard of, most of you have heard of it recently, but the link with the project we've heard of before, I think is interesting, because Judaica Europeana gathered 10 original providers, more than 15 associate providers and partners, not only in Europe, but also in Israel, in the US. And the point was it was not only intellectual, but also technical, to ingest metadata into the European Digital Library, Europeana. So we had to deal with museums, libraries, and archives, which means different mentalities, different standards, and that was one of the main difficulties. But I think that the model is interesting, a kind of special interest group which is composed of Judaica collection providers, being Jewish or not Jewish, of course, Judaica contents, that goes together to enter a multinational and multicultural portal. So it's somewhere it's getting out of the ghetto, I would say. It's gathering people with the same interest to enter something very much larger. I think that now this kind of project illustrates the fact that we have gone past the idea of centralizing everything, now centralizing the data, centralizing anything in that respect. I think that each institution or group of institutions should have its own tool to create its metadata and to host its own digital material in digital file. It's good if you can provide it to them, but I think that part of autonomy is necessary also. And one of the questions is what should be mutualized. And I think that the catalogs, finding aids, and access is crucial in that respect. And that's what we did with the Racial Network for Jewish Libraries in France, and we gathered 3, 4, 5 now, and maybe 6 libraries, and shared a common union catalog. I think that's the way to go. But now we are in the age of cloud computing, though, so maybe it's not exactly the same technicalities now. So one question is, who will be the real owner of the data in the future? And that is something to be aware of. Centralizing, I mean, it's like harvesting now with the OAI initiative, Open Archive initiative. It's giving access through generic portals. So this part is, I think, the responsibility of structures like the Israel Archives Initiative, Yerusha, Judaica Europeana, or others. But those should have this very crucial and important interest, but limited interest in it. I think that another point is the question of relation between Israel and diaspora. I think that we should, and we are hosted by the National Library of Israel, of course, and we should have a mutual respect and shared enhancements. But I think that we should still have multiple repositories of data for safety, and once again, not centralized. I think that the attention also, the question has been asked earlier about the language issues. And so that's very important also for the access and for the public. Well, I think that that's one part, the language. That's what we did with when we built the Rachel network. We were helped by the National Library of Israel and by the Bibliothèque Nationale de France to impose different standards and different authorities for the various names and titles and etc. So the other kind of the other kind of question is about localization, about mapping things, and that's part of the Yerusha project. And I think that we could go one step further in a few years. I think that we may also map archives interesting various nations which are outside of the nation or outside of Europe. And I'm talking about many French Jewish archives that are held now in mainly American collections, and that is, I think, a problem to try to solve in the future. The other interesting part in the two presentations was the discussion about the level of description. I think that you're both right, as in any discussion, you know. Economically, I think that Robin is right. When you have to begin with something, you have to just put it on the map with the resource you have. But I think that for the web and for the users, I think we have to tend to the document presentation, to give all our efforts so that each document can tell a story. I think that the idea that you have to change our way of description so that a document is not just one part of a larger set, but it is important in itself, and that's very important for the end users. Of course, it all depends on the financial and the human resources. Crowdsourcing can help in that. Still, I know all of us are not very, I would say, familiar or comfortable with the notion, but I think that we can insert more and more of this kind of practice in our work. And about the language and the representation of the data, we are going more and more towards the famous web of data. And one of the good things that Judaica Europeana brought was establishing a list of controlled vocabularies in the field of Jewish studies. 2 minutes, I don't have more than 2 minutes. In the field of Jewish studies, and that can be shared and useful to all of us. So the aim of this kind of project is to put on the map the invisible collections and to generate enough very good quality data to be present on the internet and offer new research facilities. We agree with that. What can we think of if we project ourselves, let's say 15 years from now? Nobody really knows, but I guess we'll benefit from better tools and better connections, and that will be much better technically. But still, I think that we will have to face the case that you all know of the old lady coming to the library or to the archives with a box of old papers and revealing unknown archives of the Jewish community or a Jewish society. And still, we will still have to preserve the data, the information, the documents, so we still have to have the people and the place to preserve this and to welcome the old lady. And maybe we may well preserve the old lady's memory itself by developing oral history, which would be another history. Thank you.
Our next panelist will be Hadassah Assouline, who's the director of the Central Archive for the Jewish People.
Good evening. It seems from what we've heard from the people who have spoken that I am rather an exception in this forum because I am an archivist. I began working in the Central Archives for the History of Jewish People. I won't say how many years ago, but some of you were not born when I began working. And one of the things I was taught by my predecessors and my directors one of the chief tenets of the archives was that the main enemy of the archivist is the reader. And that, thankfully, that supposition or preposition has gone from the world, and we are now trying as much as we can, as best as we can, to bring as much of our information, as much of our material to the attention of the reader in whatever form we can, digital or otherwise. The presentations that were made before describe very welcome processes and that are going on in the world of archivistics. We are participating in one of them. Hopefully we'll participate in one of the other ones. One addition I can make to one of the presentations is that the next time you speak about Yosef Trumpeldor, you can say that in the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People, there's a photocopy of his application for a disability pension from the Russian army, which we photocopied in one of the Russian military archives. That said, I'll do what most people do, and proceed to talk about myself and my organization. The Central Archives for the History of Jewish People were founded about 80 years ago in Israel, or in Palestine, by a group of historians who wish to preserve the documentary heritage of the Jewish people. This was at a time when the Jewish people in a number of countries in Europe were being persecuted and when their documentary heritage was in danger. The archives were based on two previous attempts to create documentary collections. One of them was initiated by the historian Shimon Dubnov in Russia in 1891, who sent out a call in a Jewish periodical for people to send him copies, there were no photocopies then, copies or documents or information on the whereabouts of documents which documented Russian Jewish history, so that the documentary research on Russian Jewish history could be facilitated. The second initiative was taken in Germany in 1905 by a group of German historians and by the Organization of Jewish Communities in Germany to collect archival material from German Jewish communities in order to centralize them in one location. Of course, there was no talk of digitization, but the idea that the material would be in one location was considered a boon to historians who wouldn't have to go from place to place and village to village, and they hoped thus to preserve the material, because not all the communities had the ability or even the awareness that such material should be preserved. And the founder of the archives, Yosef Meisel, came from, was born in Moravia, but came from Berlin. We had been an official of the Jewish community in Berlin and its librarian, and he was himself an active historian. Over the years, the archives collected a good deal of original material, and to this day holds material occupying some 6,000. I have musical accompaniment, which I didn't even have to ask for. Has material occupying about 6,000 running meters of shelf space, which is the equivalent of almost 60 million pages of documentation relating to many countries, to about 68 countries, according to the borders that existed between the two world wars. That adds a good number of countries. Before World War I, there were fewer countries in the world. The archives engage in another activity which is reflected in the Yerusha project, and that is following the awareness of both Dubnov and the historians of Germany that even where all of the material produced, created by Jewish communities and organizations and families, even with all this material, the material that existed in the world, even were it all collected and concentrated in one place, it would not suffice to enable, it would not enable a thorough research, historical research of Jewish history, because of the unstable nature of Jewish history and the Jewish people. They moved around a good deal, and much material was destroyed. And so each of these organizations, the Russian and the German, initiated surveys in non-Jewish archives of the countries which they were living, and compiled listings of material relating to Jews, of documents, of files, and of collections relating to Jews. The archives continue this activity, and in addition to the survey material that we conduct selective microfilming of material, knowledge of which we gain through these surveys. We have thousands of lists describing material relating to Jews. Some of the material is of Jewish provenance. In many archives, especially in Eastern Europe, Jewish collections were taken over by the authorities and were placed in the local and national archives. They have no intention of returning the material, but they are very generous in allowing us to pay for the microfilming or the digitization of the material. But most of the material is material of non-Jewish provenance relating to Jews. Jews were a small population, a minority in all of these countries, but because of their relatively greater economic, social, and intellectual activity, reflected in a greater proportion of the documentation than their proportion in the populations. And we have material from archives in about 46 countries. We have lists of material, thousands of pages of lists, which we place at the disposal of scholars, unfortunately at this point, who visit us or who correspond with us, since we have not yet digitized these lists. But we estimate that they are saved years of search for material relevant to their subjects. In some cases, we save them time. In some cases, we make them aware of material that they would never have found. Otherwise, they would never have thought to look in one particular archives for material relating to their subjects. I brought two examples. I didn't have the time to make a presentation, so we'll do a show and tell. Two examples of results of surveys which we made. In one case, the only case in which we actually canvassed an entire archives, a study was made of all the Jewish-related material in the district archives of the city of Radom in Poland. We have hundreds of pages listing the material. Of all the record groups in this archives and administrative archives, 3 of them are Jewish record groups, which were taken by them. The Jews disappeared from the scene. And most of the 80-something record groups are administrative record groups, but they're rich in material on Jews. And they're listed in hundreds of pages. Together with the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, the JICH, we printed a guide to the collections, a shortened version of these pages, which as yet are only available at the archives. Another aspect of our work is the canvassing of what are the Grod books, or the court books in the Polish court books, which are held in almost every district archives in Poland, and which judged cases between Jews and Poles and non-Jews, and in some cases between Jews and other Jews. The material is very rich. These are large volumes with material interspersed relating to Jews and to non-Jews. They're generally in Latin, and historians and archivists in Poland work for us, actually, preparing regesta, or summaries of these documents, and in some of them we have published a number of volumes. This one is an example from the State Archives in Lublin. Some of the documents have Hebrew transcriptions and Hebrew signatures and interesting Hebrew stories. They add very much to our knowledge of Polish Jewish history in these periods in the 17th and 18th century. These are the centuries that we have so far had the opportunity to study. As I said, we have such regesta or lists or surveys from archives in about 46 countries, and I thought to just give an example, one of the reasons being that I don't have a summary of all the material, but in the case of the former Soviet Union, we have conducted surveys in some archives, not in all of them, in 8 countries: Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, the Ukraine, Europe, and Uzbekistan, which isn't European, which had a sizable Ashkenazi population during World War II. We have worked in archives in 67 towns in these countries. The number of archival institutions, we have visited 102 archival institutions, and we have succeeded thus far in surveying, in describing the contents of 823 different funds or record groups. In some cases, only one record group. In some cases, such as in the National Historical Archives, the Russian Historical in St. Petersburg, 101 record groups. And we find a variety of information relating not only to the Jews of that particular country, but there's a great cross-section. For instance, in the archives of the German Foreign Office, we find material relating to the Jews of Morocco and Iraq. In the Russian archives, especially the one of the archives of the spoils in Moscow, we found material relating to Jews in almost every country in Europe, belonging to Jews in every country in Europe. In the archives of the British National Archives of Public Record, also we found material relating to the Jews of Turkey and Palestine. All of this material enables us to conduct, or to at least to attempt to conduct, part of a reconstruction of the Jewish documentary heritage of the Jewish people. We are not as digitized and as computerized as we would like to be, not because of any objection or any archival, any tradition which we inherited from our predecessors, but because of a relative lack of funds. We hope that some of this will be alleviated in the near future through the cooperation that we intend to carry out with a number of institutions. We do have a website which is conducted by us, and we upload to it as much information as possible. We digitize on a fairly small level, my position being that before we digitize on a large scale, we should see to it that our entire catalog is computerized and uploaded on the web, so that people know not just the contents of one small collection, but that they know what do we have and what can be of interest to them. That's a nutshell.
Yes, we'll take a few questions now. So if the panelists will...
Okay,
sorry, yes, please.
Michelle Chesner, Columbia University. After hearing the fantastic presentations of what's going on that Robin and Chezkie gave, my question is twofold. Number one, are you guys talking to each other? And are your databases going to be compatible with each other? And number two, sort of taking it further, there are databases such as Archive Grid, Archive Finder, which catalog archives within the United States, within the UK. Are those on your agenda? Because they do have a lot of Jewish information as well. I'm as a Western Hemisphere person, I'm sort of thinking, well, okay, what about us and the longer term and the global, the whole world? So that's really where I'm.
Sure. So first, we do talk to each other, I'm happy to say.
I may testify.
And we have been since the beginning, actually. I came to Israel a year ago and heard a presentation as well at the same time on the Israeli Archives Network. And we've been talking about how to make our networks compatible. I think the key difference to point out is that unlike Chezkie's network, unlike Ray or Ian, we are going to the catalog, we are going to the collection level rather than to the item level. So that's the key difference. But we do aim to make them compatible, and in fact we're talking with the National Library about possibly transferring a Yerusha to the National Library once we have it all set up, for them to maintain it going forward once we have the infrastructure set up. So then, of course, we would like them to work in concert. And about your other question about other sorts of portals to archives, yes, we have talks with many people, but there are so many people out there that it's hard to know who best to talk to. We have a panel of advisors, and we trust their views. So we, of course, welcome any collaboration, but as this is still quite early days, I'm actually not quite able to say yet which ones we are going to collaborate with and which ones not, because we've not yet set up our portal. And we're only going to be beginning those phases coming in the autumn.
Hi, I'd like to hear a little bit more about crowdsourcing at Yad Vashem. And I'm also wondering to what degree there's verification going on. So is this a case of Yetzas Charo Behefsedo in terms of manpower?
Well, we are testing it in the last few years. It's not, I mean, in the beginning we did it in much more traditional way. We allowed people, when we uploaded the first huge database, names database in 2004, we allowed, and we still allow people to send us corrections, but this is an email actually. So no one sees it. So there is no interaction between the people. Then later on we tried Facebook and then other social features like that. And we were quite, there were a lot of arguments, a lot of discussions, quarrels actually, for months, for years in Yad Vashem about that because of the sensitivity. But whenever, so we do it in a very cautious way, step by step. And even here, as you saw, we allowed people to comment only if they were registered not in Yad Vashem, not as Yad Vashem friends, but in Google account, Yahoo account, or something like that, and it prevented a lot of people from being from sending us nonsense. But yet 700 people did it, and in 2 cases only we had to take out incorrect comments or things like that.
2 cases actually.
Two cases, not 2 people, 2 cases only, which is nothing. So we are encouraged to continue with that. We tested it only on the whole collection, only in the photograph, on the complete photograph archive. Now we are trying to expand it on other databases, and which has a lot of headache because you have to know that, for example, even Google, which we cooperated with, don't have a sufficient tool to handle correctly or sufficiently, from our perspective, comments from the public. It sounds weird, but those are the facts. And we didn't find yet a correct tool for that, so we are now investing in implementing such a tool. So we are in the beginning of that journey, and you are invited to join us. I mean, it's something that I think we have to do it. There is no other way to do it. And even if if Yad Vashem is doing it, then others might take the risk and be there as well, I assume.
I have so many questions. It's just not fair to think where to start with one. But I think the one I would want to ask is that so much progress has been made. I'm speaking to Haim. Is it possible to share some of the achievements? For example, the fact that Google indexed your database. If all of our databases be indexed, we could search in Google and find everyone's information. And we wouldn't need what was used here many times, the term a single search portal. I want you to note how many single search portals we have in this room. So it was just a thought. I don't know, Protexia, we're in Israel. Maybe there's somebody there that can now work alongside the people in this room to index their own databases.
We try in parallel both ways. I mean, we still use our own cataloging system, and we also import things to the flat tools of Google because it's flat. But we had to take a very, very brave decision when doing it with Google, because I think most of you knows that there is no URL for most of the items in our archives. Even if it's online, then you have to get to our site and then to use our database and then look inside, because we are protecting our holdings from, all those bad guys out there. And in Yad Vashem, we had 2 years of discussions about that. So the decision to open, actually to give a single URL for each one of the items was really a revolution. And up to now, we have discussions about that in Yad Vashem, if it's good or not. But this is the bravest decision that the archives has to take now, to give a URL, because this will be the only way that Googlers will find it. Without that, they'll find all your holdings, by the way, or most of it, that were taken by others, to students who took it and put it in their seminar paper, but not with your context. They'll find it there, not in your archive. This was what led us to this.
Some of these students do have itemized URIs.
So,
I think we still need Google to help us.
well, speak with them.
I want to thank the panelists, and I specifically want to address the speakers. First of all, Chezkie, wow. someone who proposes a solution, not just a problem. That's unprecedented, and it looks viable, so thank you. I had a question for Robin that I guess speaks maybe to all of us, which is because we're talking about Judaica, and we're talking about Jewish archives, but all of the non-Jewish sources of, meaning institutional, private, that have related material, I'm just wondering, in doing a survey of existing content, are you surveying non-Jewish, the Vatican, all kinds of, I mean, that's a big one, but there must be many, 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 many sources, and I'm just wondering how, are you doing it, and if so, how are you approaching these less visible collections and resources to survey?
Well, I think that's actually one of our raison d'etre. Because we are, in fact, looking at non-Jewish archives, the state archives, the regional archives, but we ourselves are not going out and doing that work. We have projects that have already been completed or that are underway or that will be taking on that sort of work going forward. So, for instance, the JTS survey that I mentioned before, they've surveyed regional and state archives in Moscow and St. Petersburg, Belarus, and Ukraine. Our aim is not to go and replicate that work, but instead to take up completed projects and ingest them into our portal. Similar work, as you've mentioned, has been done in Italy. Similar work in the UK, I know. So our aim is not to reinvent the wheel, but instead to use work that's already been done, but instead to make it more available, to disseminate that work as widely as possible.
People cooperate?
People cooperate. Maybe it's the name or maybe it's the funding.
No, but maybe Hadassah, you want to comment on that? Because you've done it for many years.
Yes,
now.
in most of the archives in the 48 countries in which we've conducted our surveys are non-Jewish archives. And most of the collections that we've scanned or that we've surveyed, scanned in a not in a literal term, most of the collections are not Jewish collections, but they are administrative collections, sometimes even ecclesiastical collections, although the church is not as cooperative as the governments are. And they are non-Jewish sources, but they relate to Jews. They mention Jews, and they provide a good deal of information. In many cases, more information than the Jewish sources we were able to find, and in some cases, more significant information, historically significant information. Definitely.
Robin mentioned the Leo Baeck Institute conducted in conjunction with the Historical Commission in Berlin a project survey of the former East German archives, and then another project about the pre-45 German territories, and these are 95%. Non-Jewish archives, state archives, local archives. The fact that there is a lot of Jewish material in those archives also says a lot about the condition in which people used to live. So the archives themselves already reflect a lot of social history, and that the degree to which the Jewish population was integrated into the general social process, business-wise, in terms of governmental affairs. And I mean, I think these are also aspects that need to be reflected or discussed. I mean, the degree to which this is something that goes beyond the pure sort of archival repository concerns, but goes into the more academic issues of how to evaluate this material, and also sort of what kind of possibilities are created with these kind of surveys, what kind of histories can be written, because it's of course dependent on the source situation. And I mean, just to add something from the Center for Jewish History in New York, by all these different archives coming together, a new sort of field, I mean, it's not new qualitatively, but that working at the center, you're able to go across these different areas, collections, languages, and so on, which, I mean, of course, you always could do, but with a great degree of effort and difficulty. And so, I mean, I think it needs to be pointed out that these aggregations of source material open sort of other levels of qualitative, qualities, so to speak, yeah.
Any additional questions?
Yes, question. I have a question to Hadassah. Just to know, do you plan to offer something on the internet, online, in the future, digitized catalog or collections, and in which delay, or I mean,
Delay, we would very much like to place a catalog on the internet, except that our catalog is not fully computerized. What we are doing we are placing on the internet all the lists that we compile, since they were all compiled now digitally. And so every list which is completed, every catalog which is completed is immediately placed on the internet. Ideally, we would upload the entire catalog. We would computerize it first and upload it, and then begin digitizing collections. But that's ideally. And the word delay is a very term. That depends on resources, human resources, and of course, financial resources.
I would mention that the National Library and the Central Archives are in discussion to see how we can work together in order to expedite or move forward the process that Hadassah was talking about, because we think that the Central Archive has a tremendous collection of historical, especially the work they have done going into all these archives which are not necessarily Jewish and are not necessarily the archives that would be interested in helping projects like Yerusha, because it's records. They don't care about the fact that I would say they don't care, but I don't think that's not their essence. And their level of cooperation is a much lower level of cooperation, and that's where the Central Archive has done a lot of work in going and finding those materials and aggregating them together and making them accessible.
I wanted to ask you a question regarding the use of the international standard of description for archives. This is a natural language, free text standard. Are you going to use also any indexing standards or keywords?
Yeah, so definitely. First of all, the idea is to implement standards, archival standards, in the context of the project, in terms of the metadata that we're bringing in. We're definitely also intending on using keyword lists, controlled vocabularies in the project as well. Absolutely. And well, as far as where the project is holding as a whole, we have not even reached this stage yet at all. So it's definitely, it will definitely be implemented. But at this point, we're still in the, I guess you could say, even pre-pilot stage. In other words, we are still waiting on the funding for the core funding for the project. So we've begun the project, we've begun implementing the infrastructure, but that's it. We're really just at the infrastructure stage of the project. So that's an element that would come a bit later once the portal is up, once the archive management system is up, once the digital preservation system is in place, then we can go ahead and start working on implementing indexing standards and controlled vocabularies and semantic web tools and elements like that. So.
Okay. Just to summarize, I think that both Yerusha and Lee have the potential of actually changing the archival landscape, of the Jewish archival landscape, by bringing together. They're both in very early stages. Would that be a correct description?
Well put.
But I think that maybe in 3 years from now we'll have another conference and maybe we'll be able to hear a much different and also what has been learned through these projects, what worked, what didn't work. So good luck. We're looking forward.
Yes, thank you.